He did not say hello. He said, "We've decided to move forward without you on the Sycamore filing." That was it. 8 years of work reduced to one sentence delivered between 2 bites of whatever he was eating. I could hear the television in the background. I heard my mother laugh at something on the screen. I heard my sister's voice somewhere farther in the house. I said, "Okay." He paused. He expected more. He always expected more from me, but only the kind of more that was useful to him. Anger he could redirect. Tears he could dismiss. What he could not handle was stillness. So I gave him stillness. He said, "We're simplifying things." I said, "I understand." He waited again. Then he said, "You'll still be part of the family, Serena." I wrote down the time in my notebook. 7:44 p.m. I had been keeping a log for 6 months by then. Not because I was planning anything dramatic. Because I had worked in compliance long enough to know that the moment people stop documenting is usually the moment they need the record most. I told him goodnight. He hung up first. I sat at my kitchen table for about 10 minutes. Not crying, not angry, just running the numbers in my head, the way you do when a process is finally completing after a long time of knowing it would. Then I opened my laptop and started writing the first of what would become 11 formal withdrawal notices. By the next morning, everything they had been hiding behind was visible. My name is Serena Malik. I am 35 years old. I work in property compliance auditing. For the past 8 years, that has meant reviewing permit filings, license documentation, and regulatory submissions for real estate development projects. Before that, I spent 4 years in a city planning office, learning how those systems worked from the inside. I am telling you this because it matters for what happened. My job is not exciting at dinner parties. Nobody asks about it at family gatherings. My sister once introduced me to her friends as someone who does paperwork for buildings. I smiled and did not correct her. I had stopped correcting people by then. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. Drop your city in the comments. I read every one of them. My grandmother's name was Dorothy Carver. She was my mother's mother. She died at 81 in late October, 3 years before that Tuesday phone call. She had built a residential property holding company over 40 years, starting with a single duplex she bought in her early 30s with money she had saved working as a bookkeeper. By the time I was a teenager, the company held 12 properties and had filed on 2 commercial lots. By the time she died, it was 23 properties, a management arm, and a licensing entity her attorney had helped her structure in the last decade of her life. She was not warm in the way people mean when they say that. She did not hug freely, she did not praise loudly. But she was precise, and she was fair, and she had a way of watching people that made you feel like she was reading the second page of whatever you said. She noticed things. She remembered dates. She kept folders, actual paper folders, organized by year, cross-referenced with tabs. When I was 22 and starting in city planning, she called me on a Sunday and asked if I would review a permit application her attorney had submitted. She said it felt wrong to her, but she couldn't say why. I read it and found a zoning classification error that would have delayed the filing by 4 months and cost her a contractor deposit. I told her what I found and what to ask her attorney to correct. She said, "Good eye." That was the whole conversation. After that, she called me with questions maybe twice a year, always specific, always about documents. She never asked my father. She never asked my sister Claudia. She never asked my mother. She asked me. When she died, her attorney read the trust provisions to the family in his office. The conference room smelled like carpet cleaner and old wood. My mother sat to my left. My father sat across from her. Claudia sat at the far end checking her phone. The trust left the management of the holding company's licensing entity to me, specifically. Not to the family generally, not to a committee. To me, contingent on my maintaining an active professional compliance license. She had written it that way on purpose. Her attorney said so directly. He said she had revised the trust 2 years before she died and that the revision was deliberate. My father's expression when the attorney finished reading was the most honest face I had ever seen him make. It lasted about 3 seconds before he replaced it with a version of calm that he had been practicing his entire adult life. My mother said, well, Dorothy always had her own way of seeing things. Claudia put her phone down. My father's name is Gerald. He is the kind of man who has always been more concerned with how things appear than with what they are. That is not a character flaw in isolation. Most people care about appearances to some degree. With my father, it was more structural. He had built an identity around being the capable one, the head of the family, the man other men deferred to. He had worked for 30 years in commercial real estate sales and had done well enough that it was easy to let him believe his own version of the story. The problem was that he had also spent 30 years attaching himself to things other people had built and slowly revising the origin story until he appeared closer to the beginning of it. My mother, Patricia, was not complicit in a calculated way. She was more like the wallpaper in every room that made it easier to pretend the walls had always looked like that. She smoothed things. She softened the language of whatever my father said. She made his version of events sound reasonable in rooms where she felt the ground shifting. Claudia was 4 years younger than me. She was prettier, louder, more comfortable wanting things openly. My father admired that in her. He called it confidence. What it actually was permission. She had been given permission her entire life to want things openly while I had been given a different lesson, which was that wanting things quietly was more respectable, but also more ignorable. Neither of them were bad people in the movie sense. They were something more ordinary than that. They were people who had learned to use whoever was useful and call it family. After my grandmother died, I became very useful. My formal role was that I held the compliance license that the licensing entity required to remain active. That license took me 7 years of continuing education, 2 exams, and 3 years of supervised practice to obtain. It allowed the holding company to file permit applications, submit regulatory documentation, and operate under the property management classification that gave them preferred processing status with the city. Without an active license holder named in the entity structure, the company could not file. Without filings, properties could not be developed. Without development approval, the 2 commercial lots my grandmother had acquired sat unusable. My father understood this within about 30 days of the trust reading. I know this because 30 days after the trust reading, he called me on a Sunday and asked me to review a permit application. It was the first time he had ever asked me anything professional. I reviewed it. I found 2 errors. I corrected them and returned the document without comment. He thanked me in the way he thanked contractors, which is to say, not warmly, but as if the service had been rendered adequately. That was how it started. For the next 8 years, my name appeared on every filing that entity produced. Not occasionally, not as a courtesy. On everything. My license number was on the regulatory submissions. My professional credentials were listed in the operating documents. My signature or my electronic authorization appeared on permit applications for 6 different development projects, 2 rezoning requests, 1 environmental impact response, and the annual license renewal filings every January 15th. I was not paid for this. Not formally. My father occasionally gave me what he called a contribution toward expenses around the holidays. One year it was $800. One year it was $1,200. One year it was a gift card to a restaurant I had mentioned once. He kept no record of these. He preferred not to create records of what he owed people. I was not thanked for this. Not publicly. Claudia received acknowledgement at family dinners for helping coordinate staging on properties that were being sold. My mother received acknowledgement for hosting. I received, at most, a general statement about how fortunate the family was to have people who understood the technical side. I was not involved in financial decisions. I was not consulted on development strategy. I was not invited to the meetings where the plans were made. I was called after the plans were made to review the documentation that the plans required. My father had found a way to extract exactly what he needed from my expertise while keeping me at arm's length from everything that would have made that expertise feel meaningful. I noticed this around year 3. I let it continue anyway for reasons I have spent a long time understanding. Some of it was loyalty. Some of it was the belief that things would improve. Most of it was something smaller and harder to say out loud, which is that I had spent my whole life being useful in ways that were invisible, and I had mistaken that for belonging. The Sycamore project was a commercial development filing my father had been building toward for 2 years. It was the largest project the entity had attempted. It required a conditional use permit, a revised zoning variance, and 3 separate regulatory sign-offs. The filing window was narrow, tied to a municipal review cycle that only opened every 18 months. 6 months before that Tuesday phone call, I had begun reviewing the preliminary documents my father's attorney had drafted. I found a problem, not a small one. The contractor certifications attached to the application referenced a licensing code that had been reclassified 14 months earlier. Using the old code on a new application wasn't technically illegal, but it was materially inaccurate, and if a reviewer flagged it, it would trigger a secondary audit of the entire application history. That audit would have reached back through several previous filings, all of which carried my name. I flagged it in writing. I sent an email to my father, to the attorney, and to the project coordinator on July 9th at 11:22 in the morning. I asked for the certifications to be updated before submission. I asked for written confirmation that the correction had been made. I did not receive written confirmation. I received a phone call from my father 3 days later in which he said the attorney had reviewed it and it was fine. I asked which attorney reviewed it specifically. He said the same one who drafted the application. I said that attorney was not a regulatory specialist. He said, "Serena, we have been doing this for years. I think we know the process." I documented the call. I sent a follow-up email restating my concern. I asked again for written confirmation of the correction. Over the next 6 months, I sent 4 follow-up emails. I received no written response to any of them. I received phone calls in which my concerns were described as excessive, overly cautious, and, in one call from Claudia, who had no professional role in this matter, paranoid. On October 14th, 2 weeks before the filing deadline, I received a draft of the final application for my authorization signature. The contractor certifications had not been changed. I did not sign it. I sent an email on October 14th at 6:38 p.m. stating clearly that I would not authorize the application as drafted, that my professional license could not be attached to a filing containing materially inaccurate certifications, and that I required the corrections to be made before I would proceed. My father called me at 7:43 the following Tuesday and told me they had decided to move forward without me. I said okay. I wrote down the time. I opened my laptop, and I started writing. Let me explain what I actually did, because I think without that, the rest of what happened doesn't land the way it should. Property compliance auditing is not a glamorous field. Nobody grows up wanting to do it. What it is, practically, is this. When a developer wants to build something, modify something, or operate something under a regulated classification, they have to submit documentation to multiple agencies proving that what they are doing meets a specific set of legal and procedural requirements. Those requirements change. Codes get updated. Licensing classifications get revised. What was acceptable on a filing 5 years ago may not be acceptable today, and if you use the old language on a new filing, you can trigger a review that reaches backward as well as forward. My job, in my professional life outside of the family company, was to catch those errors before they became problems. I worked for a mid-sized auditing firm. I reviewed compliance documentation for commercial and residential developers across 3 counties. I had done that work for 11 years, and I was good at it. Not because I had a special talent, but because I had learned to read documents the way my grandmother read people, looking for the second page of what was actually being said. The reason my license mattered to the holding company was specific. When my grandmother set up the licensing entity in the last decade of her life, she had structured it to qualify under a professional management classification. That classification allowed the company to access a preferred processing tier with the city. Faster review timelines, priority scheduling on permit hearings, a dedicated contact at the planning department rather than the general queue. In practical terms, it could shave 2 to 4 months off a development filing cycle. That classification required an active license holder named in the entity's governing documents. Not a silent partner, not a credential on file somewhere. a named, active, professionally licensed individual who was responsible for the accuracy of the regulatory submissions the entity produced. That individual was me. What that meant, specifically, was that my license number appeared on every permit application. My professional credentials were listed in the entity's annual renewal with the state licensing board. My name appeared in the signature block of the regulatory submissions. If a reviewer had a question about the accuracy of a filing, the first call went to the named license holder. If a filing was found to contain material errors, the first professional liability question pointed to the named license holder. My father knew this in the general sense. He knew my license was necessary. He understood it the way you understand that a building needs a foundation, not in terms of how the foundation is actually constructed, but in terms of what happens if it isn't there. What he did not fully understand, or perhaps chose not to examine, was the degree to which my professional reputation was attached to everything that entity produced. He thought of my license as a credential he had access to. He did not think of it as something I had built, something I was responsible for, something I could lose. Let me give you the actual shape of what 8 years looked like. Year 1, I reviewed 2 permit applications and corrected a total of 4 documentation errors. Minor things. Formatting issues and 1 outdated reference code. I did not bill for this time. Year 2, I reviewed 1 rezoning request and caught a substantive error in the property description that would have made the application legally deficient. If that error had been submitted, the application would have been rejected and the filing fee forfeited. The fee was $3,400. Nobody acknowledged what I had found. My father told the attorney the application had been cleaned up before submission. I was not mentioned. Year 3, the entity added 2 properties. Both required compliance filings. I reviewed all of them. There was a period of about 6 weeks that year where I was working evenings and weekends on family company documents while also managing a full caseload at my actual job. My supervisor at the firm, a man named Marcus Webb, asked me once if I was sleeping enough. I told him I had some family obligations I was working through. He nodded and did not push. He was that kind of person. Year 4, there was a problem with the environmental certification on a lot my father was trying to develop on the west side of the city. The certification had been issued by a contractor whose license had lapsed. A lapsed license on a certification made the entire environmental filing invalid. If it had been submitted that way, it would not just have been rejected. It would have been flagged for the kind of review that gets shared with other city agencies. I found the lapse when I was reviewing the contractor credentials as part of my standard check. I told my father's attorney on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday, they had a new certified contractor beginning the reinspection. Nobody said thank you. My father told me at a family dinner 2 weeks later that the environmental issue had been handled and that the attorney had caught it. I looked at my plate. I had documented my Thursday call in my own files. I had kept the email thread. I let it go. Year 5, Year 6, Year 7. The pattern repeated itself. I reviewed, I corrected, I flagged, I followed up. The entity's projects moved forward. My father's reputation as a capable developer was maintained. At family gatherings, he talked about the projects the way people talk about things they built, using the first-person singular. Nobody in those rooms knew my name was on the paperwork that made those projects possible. Claudia, by this point, had a title in the company, Director of Property Relations. It was a title my father had created for her. What it meant in practice was that she met with real estate agents when properties were being sold, and she coordinated the staging and photography. She was good at that. She had an eye for how things looked, and she understood what buyers responded to. I did not minimize that. But she received a salary for it. She received an office title. She received acknowledgement at dinners. When the company was discussed in front of people outside the family, her name came up. Mine did not. I had a conversation with Marcus Webb about this once, obliquely. I told him I was doing some additional work that wasn't being compensated, and I wasn't sure how to think about it. He looked at me for a moment and said, "Is the work creating professional liability for you?" I said, "Yes, potentially." He said, "Then it isn't really voluntary." I wrote that down afterward. It was the most useful framing I had encountered, and it was given to me in about 15 seconds by someone who was not my family. There is a moment in every long pattern where you can see the whole shape of it. Not the details, not the individual incidents, but the architecture. Where the weight has been placed, and how long the structure has been leaning. For me, that moment came in the second year of the Sycamore project, about 14 months before my father's Tuesday phone call. I had been reviewing the preliminary site documentation when I noticed something that wasn't an error exactly. It was an absence. The entity's insurance coverage, which was required under the licensing classification, had not been updated to reflect the increased project scope. The policy limit was the same as it had been 4 years earlier. The project value had increased significantly. If anything had gone wrong during the development process, the liability gap between the coverage and the actual exposure was, by my calculation, substantial. I raised it, in writing on April 3rd, at 2:11 in the afternoon. I asked for the policy to be reviewed and updated before the project advanced further. My father called me that evening and said the insurance was handled and that I did not need to involve myself in financial decisions. I noted that the insurance was a compliance requirement, not a financial preference. He said, "Serena, you review permits. Let the people who manage money. I read that sentence back in my head several times after I hung up. You review permits. 8 years. 6 development projects. Dozens of filings carrying my license number, my credentials, my professional liability. And the sentence that described my role was, you review permits." I did not argue with him. I sent a follow-up email reiterating the insurance concern and asking for written confirmation that the policy had been reviewed. I did not receive written confirmation. I kept the email thread. I kept all of them. What my father did not know, and what I had not told him, was that I had spent the previous 6 months doing something methodical and quiet. I had gone back through every filing the entity had produced during the 8 years my name was attached to it, and I had documented what I found. Not because I was building a case. Not because I was planning what came next. I did it because I was a compliance auditor, and when something started feeling structurally unsound, that is what I knew how to do. I assessed it. What I found was this: 6 of the filings contained errors that had been corrected before submission, none of which were documented as corrections in the public record. 3 filings referenced contractor credentials that I had not personally verified, meaning my authorization had been attached to certifications I had not directly confirmed. And the Sycamore application, in its current draft form, would be the first filing I had ever been asked to authorize that contained an error I had explicitly flagged in writing and been overruled on. That last part was the line. I could explain the others. Time pressure, trust in the process, reasonable reliance on the attorney's review. Those were defensible positions. Authorizing a filing after putting my objection in writing and having it ignored was not defensible. Not professionally, not ethically, and not legally if it was ever examined. My father thought he was telling me I was no longer needed on Tuesday evening at 7:43. What he did not understand was that the moment he said that, I became free to do something I should have done much sooner. I was going to remove my name from everything, systematically, formally, in writing, and then I was going to wait and see what the entity looked like when the structure they had built their plans around was no longer there. The first notice took me 45 minutes to write, not because I didn't know what to say, because I wanted to say it exactly right. Compliance documentation has a particular discipline to it. Every word either belongs or it doesn't. You don't include language that could be read 2 ways. You don't leave room for the other party to claim they misunderstood. You state what is true, what is being done, and what the effective date is. Then you stop. I wrote the first notice to the entity's registered attorney. His name was Philip Garrett. He had been my grandmother's attorney originally, then my father had kept him after she died. He was competent and thorough, but he had learned over 8 years to filter his communications through my father rather than through me, which was not something I had ever formally objected to, but which I noted. The notice stated that effective in 30 days, I was withdrawing as the named license holder from the entity's governing documents. It stated that my professional compliance license would no longer be available for use in any regulatory submission, permit application, or licensing renewal filed by the entity. It stated that the withdrawal was formal, that it was being submitted in writing, and that I would be filing a concurrent notification with the state licensing board advising them of the change in my professional affiliations. I gave 30 days because that was the professionally appropriate notice period. Not because I owed them 30 days in any warm sense. Because 30 days was correct and I was going to do this correctly. I sent it at 9:14 p.m. on the Tuesday my father called. Then I started the second notice. The second notice went to the state licensing board. This one was a standard form, a professional affiliation update, but I attached a cover letter. The cover letter stated that I was removing myself from an entity affiliation and that any future filings using my license number in connection with the holding company or its licensing entity should be flagged as unauthorized. I asked the board to timestamp the receipt. They did. I have the confirmation email. The third notice went to the city planning department, specifically to the compliance liaison I had worked with over the years on the entity's filings. Her name was Renata Kim. She was thorough and had always been professional with me. I informed her in writing that I was withdrawing from my affiliated role with the entity and that any permit applications or regulatory submissions filed after the 30-day notice period bearing my name or license number should be treated as potentially unauthorized. I asked her to note the date of the communication in the entity's file. She responded the next morning at 8:52 a.m. She said she had noted it and that she appreciated the advance notice. She said, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't quote other people's words verbatim, that it was unusual to receive that kind of proactive communication and that she would flag the file accordingly. I thanked her and kept the thread. Marcus Webb called me that Wednesday afternoon, not because I had told him anything yet, but because he had a way of sensing when something was in motion. He asked if I had a few minutes. I said yes. He asked how the family company situation was going. I told him I had initiated a formal withdrawal. There was a pause. Then he said, "Do you need anything documented on our end?" I told him I might eventually. He said to let him know. Then he said one more thing. He said, "Make sure you keep the originals of everything you send." I told him I already had. He said good, and that was the end of the call. 4 minutes total. That was Marcus. He did not perform concern. He just acted on it. Over the next 6 days, I sent 8 notices in total. The 4th went to the entity's insurance broker. I informed him that I was withdrawing from my named role within the entity and that my professional credentials should be removed from the policy documentation at the time of the next renewal. I noted that the current policy had not been updated to reflect the project scope increase I had flagged in April. I asked him to confirm receipt. He confirmed within 2 hours. He also, without me asking, noted in his reply that the scope discrepancy I mentioned had not been addressed on his end either. I filed that reply carefully. The 5th notice went to the mortgage servicer holding the financing on one of the active development properties. This one was more specific. My name appeared in the loan documentation as the compliance officer for the entity. That was not a title I had agreed to. It had been included in the loan application paperwork without my specific authorization. I had signed a general authorization document early in the loan process, but had not reviewed the final submission carefully enough to catch how broadly my credentials had been applied. When I reviewed the loan documents as part of my audit that fall, I found my name in a section I had not been made aware of. The 5th notice informed the servicer that I was not, and had not been, the compliance officer for the entity in any formal capacity, and that my professional credentials had been applied to their documentation without my specific authorization for that designation. I did not use the word forged. I used the phrase applied without specific authorization. That was precise. That was what I could document. The servicer's compliance department responded in 3 days. They asked for clarification on the scope of my original authorization. I sent them the documents I had signed, with the relevant sections highlighted, alongside the loan document section where my credentials appeared. I let the comparison speak. The 6th, 7th, and 8th notices went to 3 contractors who had worked on entity projects and whose certifications had been submitted under filings carrying my license number. I informed each of them that I was withdrawing from my affiliated role and that any future communications about ongoing projects should go directly to the entity rather than to me. 2 of them replied with brief acknowledgments. The third one, a mechanical contractor named Torres Engineering, replied with something more substantive. Their project manager said that he had been wondering who to contact because they had received a request from the entity to update their certification documents for the Sycamore filing, but the request had asked them to backdate the update to appear as though the certification had been in place before a specific inspection date. He said they had not complied with the request, and he wanted to know if I was aware of it. I read that email 3 times. Then I forwarded it to Marcus Webb with no commentary. He called me within 20 minutes. He said, "Serena, this is not a family issue anymore." I told him I was aware of that. He said he would connect me with the firm's legal counsel. I said yes. He said to stop sending any further notices until I had spoken with them. I sent no further notices that day. The legal counsel Marcus connected me with was a woman named Diane Yi. She was a regulatory attorney who specialized in professional licensing matters. We spoke for 1 hour and 17 minutes the following morning. She asked me precise questions, and I gave her precise answers. She reviewed the documentation I sent her in a follow-up email, 11 attachments in total. She came back to me that afternoon with her assessment. She said my withdrawal notices were appropriate and correctly executed. She said the Torres Engineering email was significant and needed to be preserved. She said the application of my credentials to the loan documentation without specific authorization was a matter I should discuss with her further before deciding how to proceed. She said the contractor certification issue in the Sycamore filing, combined with the backdating request to Torres Engineering, suggested a pattern that extended beyond careless administration. She said, "I want to be direct with you. If a filing goes in with your license number after your withdrawal date, and it contains documentation that has been manipulated, you are not just a witness to that. You're potentially a named party." I told her I understood. She said, "Good. Then we move carefully and we'll move in writing." I told her that was how I had always preferred to move. The 30 days passed the way that kind of time passes. Quietly on the outside, loud on the inside. My father called on day 4. I did not answer. He called again on day 6. I did not answer. On day 9, he sent a text message that said, "Serena, we should talk before you do something that affects the whole family." I read it twice. I did not respond. On day 11, Claudia called. I did not answer. On day 12, she sent a text that said, "You're really going to do this over paperwork?" I looked at that for a long time. Then I put my phone down and made coffee. My mother called on day 15. I let it ring. Then I called her back because she was my mother, and whatever else was true, she had not been the one who made the call on Tuesday at 7:43 p.m. She picked up immediately. She said she didn't understand what was happening. I told her I had sent a formal notice withdrawing my professional credentials from the entity. She said she didn't know what that meant. I told her it meant that after 30 days my name would no longer be attached to the company filings. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "But the Sycamore filing is in 3 weeks." I told her I was aware of the timeline. She said, "Serena, your father needs this project." I said, "I know." She waited for me to say something else. I did not say anything else. She said, "You're not being fair." I told her I had flagged the problem in the Sycamore documents in writing 4 separate times over 6 months and had received no written correction and no formal response. I told her I had found contractor certifications that had been submitted under my license number that I had not personally verified. I told her I had been informed that a contractor had been asked to backdate a certification update and that my license number was attached to the filing in which that certification would appear. I said all of that calmly, in sequence, without raising my voice. There was a long silence. Then she said, "Who told you about the backdating?" I noted that she did not ask what backdating. She asked who told me. I told her the contractor had contacted me directly. She went quiet again. Then she said she needed to speak with my father. I told her that was her choice. I told her I was going to continue moving forward with the withdrawal. I told her I cared about her and that none of this was directed at her personally. Then I said goodbye and ended the call. I sat at my kitchen table. The city was dark outside the window. My notebook was open to a page of call logs and timestamps. I turned to a clean page. I wrote, 30 days ends November 14th. Underneath that, I wrote, everything after that is theirs. On day 30, at 11:59 p.m., I sent a final confirmation notice to Philip Garrett. It stated that the 30-day notice period had concluded, that my withdrawal was now in full effect, and that any use of my professional license number or credentials in connection with the entity after this date was unauthorized. I attached copies of all prior notices, all confirmation receipts, and all relevant correspondence. I blind copied Diane on the email. I set down my phone. Then I made tea and went to bed. The first call from someone outside the family came on November 17th, 3 days after my withdrawal took effect. It was Philip Garrett. He called my personal number at 9:38 in the morning. He was professional. He was also clearly operating under significant pressure, which I could hear in the particular evenness of his tone, the kind of even that requires effort to maintain. He said he was calling to discuss the withdrawal notice and whether there was any possibility of an extension. He said the Sycamore filing deadline was in 11 days and that the entity was not in a position to replace a named license holder within that window. He said the city did not allow substitutions within 14 days of a scheduled permit hearing without a formal deferral request, which would push the hearing to the next review cycle, which was 18 months away. I told him I understood the timeline. He said, "Is there anything that could be revisited here?" I asked him one question. I said, "Philip, after I sent my first flagged notice about the contractor certifications on July 9th, was a corrected version of those certifications ever filed with any agency or included in the application documents?" He paused. Not a thinking pause. A knowing pause. He said, "I would need to review the file." I said, "I have reviewed the file. The answer is no." I told him that the certifications in the Sycamore application as of the last draft I had received were unchanged from the draft I had declined to authorize. I asked him to confirm whether that was still the case. He said he was not able to speak to the current draft without reviewing it. I said, then I would suggest reviewing it carefully before it's submitted, particularly the contractor certification section, and particularly in light of the communication I received from Torres Engineering. Another pause. Longer this time. He said he was not aware of a communication from Torres Engineering. I said, then that's something you may want to follow up on directly with my father. He thanked me for my time. I thanked him for his. I documented the call and emailed a summary of it to Diane within the hour. The calls from my family accelerated after that. My father called 7 times in 4 days. I did not answer any of them. He left 2 voicemails. The first one was controlled and asked me to call him back as soon as possible. The second one was less controlled. He said I was putting the entire family at risk over what he described as a misunderstanding about some contractor paperwork. He said my grandmother would have been ashamed of this. He said he expected me to act like an adult and resolve this before it became something nobody could walk back. I transcribed both voicemails into my log. I noted the time of each call. Claudia sent 11 text messages over 5 days. The first few were variations of disbelief. Then they shifted toward blame. One of them said, "You know what this is doing to Dad." One of them said, "You never cared about this family, you only care about being right." The last one, sent at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday, said, "I hope you're happy." I read each one. I did not respond to any of them. My mother called every other day. I answered 2 of those calls. In both of them, she cried softly and asked me to please just talk to my father. I told her I was communicating through proper channels and that I was happy to receive any formal correspondence through Philip Garrett. She said she didn't understand why everything had to be so formal. I told her the formality was not something I had introduced into the situation. The insurance broker called on November 21st. He was not calling on behalf of my family. He was calling because the entity's insurer had flagged the policy for review after my notice and had discovered the scope discrepancy I had referenced. The review had temporarily suspended the active policy endorsement on the Sycamore project while the discrepancy was assessed. Without the endorsement, the project financing was technically in default of its insurance covenant. The broker wanted to know if I had any documentation related to when the scope increase occurred and when it had first been reported to the entity's management. I told him I had sent a written notice to the entity on April 3rd identifying the discrepancy and requesting a policy update. I told him I could provide a copy of that notice and the email thread. He said that would be very helpful. I sent it to him the same afternoon with Diane copied. The project financing froze 4 days before the permit hearing. On November 24th, my father called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered because I didn't know it was him. He said my name and I recognized his voice immediately. He did not lead with anger this time. He led with something I had heard from him exactly once before in my life, at my grandmother's funeral, which was a version of need that he couldn't fully conceal. He said the project was in serious trouble. He said the financing was frozen, the insurance endorsement was suspended, and the hearing was in 3 days. He said without a named license holder, the entity couldn't appear at the hearing in the required capacity. He said he needed me to come back temporarily, just through the hearing, just to get the filing through. I let him finish. Then I said, were the contractor certifications corrected after I flagged them on July 9th? He said, Serena, that is not the point right now. I said, it is the only point right now. Because my license cannot be attached to a filing that contains certifications I flagged as inaccurate in writing 4 months ago and was overruled on. He said, we can fix it after the hearing. I said, no. You fix it before the hearing or you don't file. I paused. Then I said, and I need you to understand something clearly. My name is not available to this entity anymore. Not temporarily. Not just for the hearing. Not under any arrangement that isn't in writing and reviewed by my attorney. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, your grandmother trusted me to run this. I said, she trusted you to run it with her. She left the compliance structure to me because she understood the difference between managing and protecting. You managed, I protected. And I'm done protecting something that has been using my name without respecting it. He said, this is going to collapse the whole project. I said, I know. He hung up. I sat with the silence in my kitchen for about 3 minutes. Then I picked up my pen and wrote down the time. The permit hearing was scheduled for November 27th at 2 p.m. at the City Planning Office on Redfield Avenue. I was not required to be there. I was not a party to the filing. I had no legal obligation to attend. I went anyway. Not to confront anyone, not to watch anything collapse in real time. I went because I had spent 8 years attached to filings that went through that office, and I had never once been in the room when they were presented. I had always been the name on the paper, never the face at the table. I wanted to see what the room looked like. I arrived at 1:40 and sat in the public seating area. The hearings were open. 3 other applications were being reviewed before Sycamore. I sat quietly and watched the process I had been supporting from a distance for 8 years. At 2:07, the Sycamore application was called. My father walked to the presentation table with Philip Garrett. Claudia sat in the row behind them. She saw me before my father did. Her face changed immediately. She leaned forward and said something to my father's shoulder. He turned. He looked at me for 1 second. Then he looked forward. The hearing officer introduced the application and noted that the entity's named license holder affiliation had lapsed as of November 14th and had not been updated in the public record. He asked who was appearing on behalf of the compliance function. My father said they had been working to update the affiliation documentation. The hearing officer said the hearing could not proceed without a named license holder in current standing with the entity. Philip Garrett said they had anticipated this question and had prepared a motion to request a brief administrative continuance. The hearing officer reviewed the motion. Then he noted that the entity's insurance endorsement on the project was also currently suspended, which represented a secondary deficiency under the filing requirements. Philip Garrett said they were working to resolve the insurance matter as well. The hearing officer said he would need written confirmation of both items before the hearing could be continued to an active status. He said the next available hearing date was in the following review cycle. My father turned slightly in his chair. He was looking at the table, not at me. The hearing officer asked if there were any questions. My father said yes. He said he wanted to understand the timeline for resolution. The hearing officer said the timeline depended on when the entity provided the required documentation. He said the entity had been operating under the existing compliance structure for 8 years without interruption, and that the recent changes to that structure were reflected in the licensing board's records as of November 14th. He looked up from the file briefly. His eyes moved across the public seating. They stopped for half a second on me. He looked back down at the file. He said, "The application is administratively continued pending resolution of the named license holder and insurance deficiencies." Then he moved to the next item on the agenda. The room did not react dramatically. Rooms like that rarely do. The people around me went back to their own papers. A man to my left made a note on a clipboard. Someone's phone vibrated. But at the table, Claudia had turned around fully in her seat. She was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not anger. Something more uncomfortable than anger. Something closer to the realization that the thing you assumed would always be there is gone, and you cannot pretend anymore that you didn't take it for granted. I looked back at her calmly. Then I gathered my things and left. The private meeting happened 4 days later, on December 1st, at a restaurant near my parents' house. My mother had requested it, not my father. My mother, which told me something about where the pressure was coming from internally. I brought Diane Yee's guidance with me, but not Diane herself. I brought my blue folder. I sat down first and waited. My father arrived with my mother. Claudia was not there. I noted that. My father sat down across from me. He ordered coffee. My mother sat beside him and kept her hands folded on the table. She looked tired, in a way that had settled in rather than arrived recently. My father said he wanted to find a resolution. I opened my folder. I placed 5 documents on the table in a row. The July 9th flag notice, the 4 follow-up emails, the Torres engineering communication about the backdating request, the insurance broker's email about the scope discrepancy, and the licensing board's time-stamped receipt of my withdrawal notification. I did not explain them. I let him look at them. He looked at them for about 30 seconds. Then he said, "I never asked Torres Engineering to backdate anything." I said, "Your project coordinator did, on behalf of the entity, which you manage." He said, "That was a miscommunication." I said, "It's in writing." He looked at my mother. She looked at the table. He said, "What do you want, Serena?" I said, "I want you to understand what actually happened, not your version of it, what actually happened." I pointed to the first document. I flagged a problem 4 times, in writing. You told me I was being excessive. You moved forward without correcting it. When that became inconvenient, you called to ask me to come back temporarily and cover it. I paused. That is not how professional credentials work, and it's not how family should work either. My mother said, "We never meant to put you in a difficult position." I looked at her. "I know you believe that." She looked up. I said, "But believing it doesn't change what the documents show." My father said, "So what are you proposing?" I said, "I'm not proposing anything. I'm telling you what is no longer available. My license is not available. My credentials are not available. My name on your filings is not available." I closed the folder. If you want to restructure the entity and find a licensed professional who is properly compensated and formally acknowledged for their role, that is a path forward. But that path does not include me in the same arrangement we had. He said, "You're going to let 8 years of work fall apart?" I said, "The 8 years of work is already documented. The question is, what comes next?" I stood up. I hope you find a workable path forward. I genuinely mean that. My mother said my name. Just my name. Quietly. I looked at her. I told her I would call her. Not through the company. Just her. Then I picked up my folder and walked out. The air outside was cold, clean in the way December air sometimes is. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let it settle. Then I called Diane Yee and told her the meeting was done. She asked how I was. I said I was fine. She said, "Good. Let's talk about what comes next." I said, "Yes, let's." The Sycamore project did not recover in the next review cycle. It did not recover because the licensing deficiency was only one part of what unraveled. The insurance endorsement suspension triggered a covenant review by the project lender, which is a standard process most developers never encounter because most developers do not allow an insurance discrepancy to sit unresolved through a permit hearing. The lender's review found the scope gap I had flagged in April. They required the policy to be brought into alignment before the financing could be reinstated. Bringing the policy into alignment required the insurer to conduct a new assessment of the project. The assessment took 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, the contractor agreements on the Sycamore site expired. 2 of the contractors did not renew. One of them was Torres Engineering, which had already been uncomfortable enough about the backdating request to contact me directly. Without the mechanical contractor, the site timeline collapsed. Without the site timeline, the revised permit application the entity eventually filed was based on projections that no longer matched the available contractors. The second application was filed in the following review cycle, 14 months after the first hearing. It was reviewed by a different hearing officer. That officer found 3 procedural deficiencies in the resubmission. One of them involved the contractor certifications, which had still not been updated to the current licensing code despite the issue having been in the file since my original July 9th notice. The application was returned for correction. I know these details not because I was monitoring the situation, but because Renata Kim at the City Planning Department occasionally crossed paths with me professionally, and in the course of those professional interactions, the Sycamore file came up. She never said anything improper. She simply confirmed, when I asked a direct question, what was visible in the public record. She once said, almost as an aside, that it was unusual to see an application cycle that long for a project of that size. I said it was. She said nothing further. She was very good at her job. My father retained a new compliance consultant in January, about 6 weeks after the December meeting. I know because Philip Garrett sent me a formal letter confirming the entity had updated its license holder documentation and that my credentials had been fully removed from all governing documents. I read the letter once, filed it, and sent a brief acknowledgement. The letter was correct, and the process had been completed properly. I had no objection to note. The consultant my father retained charged a formal fee, a documented, contracted fee with a scope of work and a liability clause. I had been told once, when I raised the question of compensation early in the 8 years, that family didn't bill family. The new consultant billed $4,800 a month. I noted this without satisfaction. It was simply what the work had always been worth. Claudia's Director of Property Relations title disappeared from the entity's public filings sometime in the spring. I don't know the internal conversation that preceded that. I didn't ask. She called me once in February, about 2 months after the December meeting. It was a short call. She said she wanted me to know she had not been aware of the backdating request when it happened. I told her I appreciated her saying that. I told her I believed her. There was a silence. Then she said she was sorry things had gone the way they had. I said I was too. It was the most honest conversation we had had in about 10 years. I do not know what it means for the future. I don't think either of us does yet. My mother and I speak on the phone every 2 weeks. We talk about ordinary things. The calls are shorter than they used to be, and more honest than they have ever been. She does not bring up the company. I do not bring up the company. She asked me once, quietly, whether I was doing all right. I told her yes. She said she was glad. I think she meant it. I think she has also been carrying something heavy for a long time, and does not quite know how to set it down. I leave room for that without making it my project to fix. My father has not called me since December 1st Street. I have not called him. I do not know what that silence will eventually become. I have stopped trying to predict it. In February, I began the process of buying my own home. I had been renting for 6 years, which was longer than I had intended, but the years had been full in ways that made stillness feel impossible. There was always something the entity needed, always a filing to review, always a call to take. I had put off the purchase not because I couldn't afford it, but because I had been using the energy that belongs to your own life on other people's foundations. The property I found was a 2-bedroom house in a neighborhood I had driven through twice and noticed both times. It was not large. It did not need to be. It had a study with a window that faced east, which mattered to me, and a garden that had been neglected but was structurally sound, which I found in the inspection report to be a reasonable metaphor. The closing process took 11 weeks. I was present for every document review. I read every page. My real estate attorney, a woman named Sandra Osei, who Marcus had referred me to, said I was the most prepared buyer she had worked with. I told her I had spent 8 years reviewing other people's filings and had developed strong opinions about reading before signing. She laughed and said she wished more clients had that problem. I signed the closing documents on a Thursday morning in March. Sandra handed me the keys across the table. They were on a plain silver ring. No ceremony, no fanfare. Just a small weight in my hand that meant something had transferred. I sat in the car for a few minutes before driving to the house. The city moved around me the way it always does, indifferent and continuous. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about her brass lamp and her locked cabinet and the way she had made me sign my first payroll form twice. I thought about the Sunday phone call when I was 22 and the zoning error I had found and the 2 words she said in response. Good eye. It was the closest thing to praise she ever gave me, and it was about a document, not about me, which is exactly what she would have intended. She was not sentimental, but she was paying attention, and she had left me something that proved it. I drove to the house. I unlocked the front door and stood in the entry. The floors needed refinishing. The kitchen was dated. The east-facing study was perfect. I set my bag down and stood there in the quiet. Nobody called me from another room. Nobody needed anything reviewed by morning. Nobody was managing a situation that had my name attached to it without my knowledge. It was just a house. It was mine. My grandmother had a neighbor in her later years, a woman named Frances, who was in her 80s and had lived 2 houses down for 40 years. Frances was not family. She was simply someone my grandmother had known long enough to trust and help quietly when help was needed. My grandmother had checked on her once a week, had made sure her mail didn't pile up, had occasionally paid a contractor to fix something in Frances's house without making it a formal arrangement or a public gesture. I had my own version of that in my own building. Her name was Adela. She was 74, recently widowed, and was navigating a lease renewal on her apartment that had become confusing after her landlord sold the building. The new management company had sent her a revised lease with several clauses that were not standard and that she did not fully understand. She had mentioned it to me in the elevator once, apologetically, as if she was embarrassed to admit confusion. I asked if she would like me to look at it. She said she did not want to impose. I told her it would take me about 20 minutes. It took 35. But what I found in those 35 minutes were 2 clauses that would have allowed the management company to increase her rent significantly outside the standard renewal terms, and 1 clause that waived her right to advance notice before property inspections. I wrote her a 1-page summary in plain language and flagged the clauses. I told her what to ask the management company to remove before she signed. She looked at the summary for a long time. Then she looked at me and said, "How did you know to look for this?" I told her it was my job. She said, "Whose job is it when you're not here?" I thought about that for a while afterward. It was a small thing. It did not make a headline. It did not resolve anything large or dramatic. But Adela signed a fair lease, and she knew what she had signed, And when I passed her in the hall afterward, she nodded at me in the way people nod when something has been handled properly. That was enough. That was more than enough. I have thought a lot about what the right way is to end a story like this. Not the story of the entity or the Sycamore project or the permit hearing, the larger story. The one about what it costs to be the person in a family who knows how to hold things together. Here is what I have come to. There is a version of usefulness that looks like love and isn't. It is the kind where someone's need for you is mistaken by both of you for connection. They call when things go wrong. They rely on your judgment when the stakes are high. They defer to your expertise in private while dismissing it in public. And because being needed feels adjacent to being valued, you stay. You review the documents. You catch the errors. You fix the things that would have collapsed without you, and you tell yourself that this is what family means. It doesn't mean that. What family means is more ordinary and harder to fake. It is being acknowledged when things go right, not just called when things go wrong. It is having your name on the work when the work succeeds, not only when it needs a signature. It is someone asking how you are before they ask what you can do. When I withdrew my name from those filings, I was not punishing anyone. I was not executing a plan. I was simply stopping the thing I had been doing that was making it possible for everyone involved to avoid the truth. When your name is no longer in the machinery shows you what it actually runs on. Sometimes it runs on nothing. Sometimes it runs on things that were never accounted for properly. I do not know what my family will become. I know what I have become. Someone who reads before she signs. Someone who keeps the originals. Someone who has a home with a study that faces east and a garden that is coming back slowly. Someone who learned, later than she should have, that the people who treat your expertise as a resource they are entitled to have confused two things. They have confused what you can do with who you are, and those are not the same. They were never the same. If you have been the fixer in your family, the one who holds the paperwork, catches the problems, and gets called when things go wrong, I want you to think about one question. Not dramatically, just honestly. When was the last time someone asked how you were before they asked what you could do? You do not have to answer out loud, but you should know the answer. Drop it in the comments if you want. I will read every one. And if you have been watching for a while, and this is the first time you have felt seen by something someone said, subscribe. There are more stories like this one. Stories about people who held things together quietly for a long time and then, one ordinary evening, decided to put down something that was never theirs to carry alone. My grandmother used to say, "Fear people who rush you past the paperwork." I would add only this: fear the arrangements that never get written down. Because the things that are never written down are almost always the things someone hopes you will never examine too closely. I examined them, and then I went home.